All right. Good to see Margie and Bob in the house. And next week, I'm pretty sure Tanya will be back from her Spanish adventure. Thank you, everybody, for going into your small group just now and making space and taking space and helping us all to become a little warmer. Today, we have Wendy Gritter, who was with us a year ago. And she told me that she said next time, maybe I won't be in such chaos, the chaos of grief. And I said, well, we don't really require everyone to dress up emotionally before they arrive. That's not in our minds. Anyway, she is now emerging from another intersection of loss. Last time it was because some people she knew showed them who they really were, and it was quite painful. She may go into the present heaviness, but we will. What, is Tanya here? I saw someone say hi, Tanya.
She's here.
Wow, okay. She must be logging in from somewhere.
She's with Peter. Peter's hiding her.
Okay, awesome.
Say hi, unmuted.
Hi.
Hey, all right.
Hi, Pastor.
Hey,
Hi, everyone.
You two look beautiful together. So anyway, Dr. Wendy VanderWal Martin is a learner and an uninvited guest on the traditional lands of the Pesocomukati First Nation, where she navigates life's paradoxes as a newlywed, a dog mom, an empty nester, and one familiar with liminality. She's been a contributor to the dialogue at the intersection of faith, gender, and sexuality for the last 20 years. She is a passionate advocate for cultivating generous space within our faith communities, where we are shaped by humility, hospitality, mutuality, and justice, and we welcome that. Wendy lives in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, Canada, and it is our joy to hear from you today. So take it away, Wendy.
Thanks, David. It really is a delight to be back with many familiar faces from last year. As David was saying, I really was in the absolute chaos of grief last time I was with you. I had just learned that the ministry that I had shepherded for 20 years, that the board decided to close the ministry. And I won't go into all the details other than to say it was significant rupture and disruption of relationship, of trust, of my own sense of safety and security. And so I came to you in a lot of pain. And I remember during the dialogue time at the end, there was some very good and challenging questions that I just felt like I was in a fog to even respond to. And at the time, when David then extended the invitation for about a year later to return, I remember just thinking, boy, I hope I'm in better shape. I hope my brain works again. Now, a year later, I'm asking different kinds of questions. And my hope at that time was perhaps naive. And so I've decided to speak on the chaos of grief this morning. And I didn't anticipate that the week that I've just had would have been so heavy laden with grief. A dear friend who I was part of a congregation with for more than 20 years lost her battle with cancer this past week. 47 years old, leaving 2 young adult sons and a dearly loved husband and close-knit extended family. She was a prophet and one who was so intimately in love with Jesus, an intercessor, someone who cared for people with deep and authentic hospitality and just genuine love, leaves such an enormous loss and hole in that family. And then the day before her celebration of life service, friends that I've journeyed with for more than 20 years lost their transgender son. He was only in his mid 30s, died from complications due to COVID, and had struggled so much in his life. And I accompanied his parents to love him with a steadfast love for those years. And so I have wept a great deal this past week, which in my world means losing about 10 pounds of snot. Now, somatic psychologists say that weeping releases something. It releases some of the grief and the sorrow and the sadness that we hold in our bodies. But that for this release to come, there has to be sort of a climax of tension. And I'm not sure that much weeping brought instantaneous release or freedom. In some ways, it just felt like I got a bad sinus headache. But it has been a week again where I find myself coming to you in vulnerability and weakness. And while on one hand, I really hate that, on the other hand, I continue to learn that it is in those spaces that perhaps the presence of God amongst us is more accessible because I can get out of the way a bit more. So with that context in mind, I'm going to read a passage from Luke 22. If you have your scriptures and want to follow along, it's Luke 22 and starting at verse 39. Now, typically, I've only ever heard this text read on Good Friday. And in all my years of being part of church communities, I don't know that I've ever heard grief talked about in a gathering of Jesus followers on a Sunday morning, maybe at funerals, but not so much in our regular gatherings. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this conversation together and trust that God is present with us. And so let's hear the word. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please pray with me. In these moments we have together, Lord Jesus Christ, you who accompany us through all the aspects of our life and experience and journey, would you hide me in the shadow of the cross so that you, Jesus, would be seen and heard. Amen. This morning, I want to share with you some of my not observations, but experiences with grief as an invitation for us to reflect together on the questions that arise when we go through times of sorrow, of loss, of failure, of things being disrupted in our lives. And I think the first thing that struck me as I've navigated the last year of pretty intense grief is how disorienting grief is. Grief thrusts you into the unknown. Our text says that Jesus did his usual thing. He went to the Mount of Olives as he normally did, and yet there was nothing normal about that particular moment in the garden. Suddenly he was in the throes of the precipice of his crucifixion, and he couldn't go back to what once was, that he was thrust into this place of what we call liminality, or a threshold place, a place where something has so radically changed that we can't go back to what was, but we don't yet know what's ahead of us. We don't know what the new thing is. And so this threshold place, this place of disorientation, brings profound uncertainty. It can bring great fear. C.S. Lewis, after the death of his wife, said he didn't ever know that grief felt so much like fear, that in his very body, it felt like fear, the butterflies in the stomach, the nausea, the uncertainty. Now, these places of liminality, our temptation is to get very impatient and restless, to try to rush through that time of threshold. And we want to get out of that discomfort. We want to know what's next, and we try to force it sometimes. And grief doesn't follow our timeline. Maria opened the first service and was talking about forgiveness, actually. But one of the things she said really struck me. She said, if this was optional, we might not do it. If grief was optional, we just wouldn't show up for it. We would skip it. We would stick it in a box, put a bow on it, and lock it in a room. But in this place of liminality, the most important thing we can do is stay present, to attend to this moment that we're in right now, to feel every part of it. For a lot of my life, I've lived in my head. I've relied on my intellect for most everything. And a couple of years ago, I had a head injury that has challenged me to connect to all parts of myself, but in particular, to connect to my embodiedness. And grief invites us to pay attention to our bodies, to understand the ways that the loss, the sorrow, the failure, the mistakes, the shame, whatever it is that's catalyzing our grief, to really pay attention to it. Notice in our text that Jesus sweat so profoundly in his anguish that it was like drops of blood. To pay attention to what's happening in our body. And one of the things that happens is that grief exhausts us. Grief drains our energy. It puts us in this place of fragility and weakness that everything in us wants to resist. None of us likes to feel needy or desperate or unable to do all the things we normally do. We don't want to feel incapacitated in any way. But the exhaustion can make us very prone to thoughts and lies about ourselves or about our situation. And in that exhaustion, we're again invited to be attentive as much as we're able, not to deny that we're exhausted, not to shame ourselves for being exhausted, but to remember who we are, not what we feel like. I am the beloved of God. And no matter how much grief wrecks my life, makes it chaotic and unstable, disorients me, exhausts me, nothing and no one can change the truth that God in Christ looks at me and says, "You are mine. You belong to me. You are beloved." And if that is true of me, it is true of you. It is true of all God has made, that we can look in the mirror, and when the feelings of worthlessness or the questions about how we might get out of this tailspin we feel like we're in arise, when it feels hopeless, we look straight into that exhausted face and we say, "I belong. I'm beloved." And that energy rises up in us that says, no one and nothing can steal that, lie to me, or destroy that truth about who I am. We must give voice to our grief, that it becomes a companion in a way that exists in tension with all of the truths that bring us peace and serenity and joy. And they, in that tension itself, in the both and of grief and truth, we find that glimmer and glimpse of God's heart and new life that is coming. Everything in us wants to escape, to put it away. Jesus says to his disciples, "Don't slumber," not because they weren't exhausted, but because he did not want them to give in to the temptation of disassociating from the present pain and reality of his crucifixion. Peter was going to deny him 3 times. Jesus is saying, pray, connect with God in that moment so that you won't be tempted to avoid, to disconnect, to flee. None of us like grief. None of us like pain. And so we're invited into that place of intimacy, in that very place of exhaustion, so that we can experience God's presence in the rawness. Because grief will do everything it can to isolate us, to make us feel like we can't share this mess with others. They're not going to understand, or they're tired of us grieving. Aren't you over it yet? I come to you a year later, and in some ways, I was in complete shock when I spoke to you last year. So in some ways, I feel the pain more deeply now than I did a year ago. The lie is that we somehow have to do this by ourselves. The lie is that no one can accompany us because no one can understand. And so what we need to do again is to be attentive and remind ourselves that not only am I the beloved, and not only do I belong, but we are the beloved, and we belong, and we were knit together in a way that we are called to do life alongside one another. That in that sacred bond of 3, we find a companionship that brings grace and peace and energy and strength. The truth is, we need others to remind us who we are when we're too exhausted and disoriented to know it ourselves. Jesus calls to his disciples in his anguish, "Stay alert and awake. Be with me. I refuse the lie that would isolate me and make me that much more vulnerable to that which is not true. and not life-giving. Because grief strips us. Grief strips us of so many things that we lean on and depend on for stability and security that aren't really true and deep life-giving. Again, C.S. Lewis talked about how grief exposed his limitations of understanding God. He said his image of God was not divine. It needed to be shattered again and again and again. And grief does that. It exposes the way we create God in our own image. Anne Lamott said it this way: we can be sure that we've created God in our own image when God hates all the same people that we do. And the truth is, we're so prone to shaping God through our lens. And we think it's true, and we think it's righteous, and we think it's the objective way to view God. And grief is one of the ways in which we recognize how much we project our own experience and expectations onto God. I wish that we could grow and learn and mature through blessing and joy as much as we do through grief and loss and failure. But at least in my experience, it is in the times of suffering that we are invited into these places of threshold and growth and change. I know in my grief, I felt drawn again and again to blame, to externalize, to point out how everyone else had done me wrong, to make sense of the pain that I was feeling. And it became this incubator for spiritual challenge, to remind myself that I am interconnected, not just with the people I like or the people who think like I do, but that I'm actually interconnected with all that God has made, and that I belong with and to everyone else. I have a tattoo on my arm. I might have shown it a year ago. I don't remember. It's a quote from Desmond Tutu, and it says this: "If I diminish you, I diminish myself." And in our grief, when we're hurting so much, sometimes our inclination is to diminish others, to somehow try to soothe ourselves. But in those moments of grief, in those moments of blame casting, we're reminded that the grace we offer inevitably boomerangs back to the grace we receive, that we receive that which we give out, and that we are humanized and healed when we're able to cut those ties of bitterness or grudges or unforgiveness, that we're able to release those who've hurt us into God's hands, that we're able to be freed from the ego that demands that our platform or that our voice or that our life as it was be returned to us. The place that so desperately needs an external validation needs to be brought, as Diane prayed so beautifully, into the arms of God, who picks us up and says, "My child, I see you. You belong to me. You are my beloved." Grief is so paradoxical. It is an invitation to not think in either or, but to think in the both and, of saying, as we hold these seemingly contradictory ideas together, we can discover new life and new truth to help us take our next best steps. Grief is this invitation to rest. We can't keep up life as it was. We need to slow down. We need to make space. We need to rest from the exhaustion. And at the same time, grief is teaching us. And so we need to pay attention, be attentive, be fully present. Grief invites us to resist a sorrow that would drown us and strangle any hope. We need to resist that and yet We need to welcome grief as an accompaniment in our life. For those of us who've lost an intimate loved one, grief doesn't end. Grief is part of our journey moving forward. And so we need to both resist and welcome. Grief means that there's a sense of absence that we bargain about and we get mad about and we have glimpses of an acceptance about, but there's an absence and there's also a presence. There's the gift of memory. There's the gift of welcoming a presence of perhaps one we've lost, God's presence, the presence of those who are accompanying us in our grief. Grief is unpredictable. It blindsides us when we least expect it. And we almost become a little gun shy or tired of being so vigilant for the unexpected moments of grief. And yet grief is also just a constant reality. Grief often makes us angry. And the challenge is to discern, is that anger an energizing moment, energizing us to act towards life and flourishing? Or does that anger drag us into our false self, into a place where we no longer are the person with the kind of integrity and character that we desire to be? So grief has this anger, and yet grief is also this invitation to serenity, to letting go, to acceptance. In this place of tension, we must remember Jesus in the garden. We must remember a God who took on human flesh, who became incarnate, who emptied themselves to become just as we are, a God who suffers, a God who sorrows, a God who grieves, a co-suffering God, a God who is with us. God defeats death, not by waving a magic wand and eradicating it, but by dying and then moving to resurrection. We can't avoid the pains of life, but we're invited to be present and attentive to all that God has for us in the midst of it. Lisa, my friend who died this week, was asked by our pastor at the beginning of her diagnosis when she was lying in a hospital bed, what she heard God saying to her. Now, this is a woman who's been given significant words from God in the past. Lisa put her head back, closed her eyes, and was silent for a number of moments. And when she opened them, she said, I am loved. That's what I hear God saying. I am loved. At her celebration of life service, Sam said that he was with her again just hours before her death and asked her again, Lisa, what is God saying to you? She put her head back, closed her eyes. And after a few moments, she said, I am loved, always and forever. This week, I gathered 6 queer elders from across Canada and the US to be on Zoom with me, to grieve and to listen, to be curious together about what God might have next for me. And it felt really vulnerable to invite them. These are all important, busy people. And I, in many ways, have felt canceled since the loss of my ministry a year ago. But I was grateful that they all responded that they would be honored to be with me. And it was awkward. I was asking, do I need to accept that my work with the LGBTQ community is over? Is that part of my grieving? Or, do I need to be discerning what might be next? And Michael Blair, who's the head of the United Church in Canada, a queer Black man from Jamaica who was kicked out of his Baptist church when he came out 30 years ago. He said, Wendy, I think you're still in the tomb. There's that time between Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection when he was in the tomb. And these wise elders, pastors, decades of spiritual leadership and pastoral experience between them, kindly and gently, tenderly said, it's too soon. You need to attend to your grief longer. You're still in the tomb. And in that tenderness and in those moments of being seen, I was reminded that I am in relationship with a God who knows what it is to suffer, who accompanies us, calls us beloved in the midst of our deep pain, and who is a God of resurrection, that even in the tomb, there's hope, because it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming. Thanks, friends.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for coming back. Every time you come, I am challenged and blessed and transformed. And happy anniversary to all of us together. Oh gosh, sorry for the ums. It's just your let me see where I am here with this. Let me share a little bit of what I pulled from this. I pulled from it the whole idea of balance, just that idea of there's balance in the universe, there's balance within your own grief. And I love, God, if grief was optional, we might not do it. that spoke to me. Not disassociating because you're in grief. Sometimes it's so much easier to close your eyes and try and shut it out. I have been so guilty of probably everything you mentioned, that process. So I am grateful. The grief will want to isolate us. Sometimes I'll reach out in my grief and I'll get my hand slapped for reaching out. And so I have been there. So grief is, I have found it to be familiar with me, and I found that I live with grief constantly. And I'm just wondering if other people feel that too. So I'm gonna just start with that and maybe open it up and see if anybody else has something to share. Shalla?
Okay, yes. I'll see if I can turn my video on here. I'm currently sitting in the room with my mom, and I got to see Wendy in the breakout room. While you were speaking, I had to get up several times, but I want you to know that you were invited, if I know for other people, but you were invited just for me. So I'm just going to be selfish and say you were invited for me, because you have ministered to me right now. And I'm going to have to go back and listen to this over and over. So Pastor, be sure to put this, I have to go back and listen to it, because at this moment, I'm probably in the tomb, but this stretch of, it's been like almost 7 years now of just doing things, and this stretch of being in the tomb has probably been one that has shaped and pulled junk out and caused me to lay down. Like even this morning, I remember saying, I know you love me. I know you love me. And I had to say, I know you love me because I'm so hard on myself sometimes. But this tomb experience, I declare that when I come out of this, I will never be the same. I will be so much freer to speak what God wants me to do, to say, or to pray what God wants. And I'm so grateful for you being here. Thank you for sharing everything you did today. It is just, it's close to my heart. Thank you.
Michael, did you want to share something?
Well, I will, but I have a question, but I want to give a caveat to Wendy, because this is a very linear question and our whole topic is not linear, but that's my limitation. You said how that we needed to give voice to our grief. How?
You know, Brene Brown just wrote a book called Atlas of the Heart, and it's focused on 87 different emotions. And her research indicated that most of us human beings really only have language for 3 different emotions: mad, sad, and glad. And I think we need to do some work in enlarging our lexicon to be able to give expression, because there's so many different facets of grief and we grieve for different reasons. Grieving a failure is different than grieving the loss of a loved one. And yet within this experience of grief, how do we connect to what are we feeling? And I think that's important because when we name those things in our own presence, I love that Howard Thurman quote, in God's presence, and when we risk naming it in the presence of others, it's not in the dark anymore. We bring it into the light. Now, that doesn't evaporate the pain, but it does break that lie of shame and isolation that I find accompany our grief so often. It's really hard when we risk breaking out of our isolation to name what we're experiencing, and someone gives us the message, we're too much, they're too busy, we're too intense, and to risk being able to say to ourselves, it's okay, they're not in the right spot, so they're not the right person, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't try again and find someone who is safe and trustworthy and has the capacity to meet me in this place. When I was weeping with the elders I met with this week, one of the things I said was, in this year, I have felt disposable. After 20 years of ministry, it's like I've been erased. Now, that's my feeling. I mean, that could be logically argued with. Wendy, 20 years doesn't disappear, blah, 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 blah. But it was about what I felt. And so to be known in my grief means I need to name that. And then the presence of God and the presence of those who love me, who are trustworthy, can be with me in that place. And hopefully, if they're skilled, the first thing they'll say is, that hurts so much, doesn't it? Right? Because we need to know we're not alone. My favorite definition of sexuality, actually, is that it's our drive to overcome our aloneness. And just like our spirituality, our sexuality is this golden thread through our personhood. And so when we're not able to connect, it is so difficult to heal. Is that helpful, Michael?
It's extremely helpful. Thank you. And I just thinking, I've had centuries of therapy, but
Same.
different therapists have given us or me feelings lists, and they help. They help. Some are much more precise or some are more expansive, but it's a way to get into that. And that's a hard thing for me. My brother and I were given the message very early in life by our father. Our mother had died, and we were shown in every way possible, don't feel.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
What a gift. Thank you.
And I would just add, I think if you grew up in an evangelical context, I grew up in a Reformed context, we were taught to distrust our feelings as the likelihood that that was the portal to self-deception. So we had to rely on scripture, we had to rely on church doctrine. We were taught to not honor and not trust what we were feeling. And that has done a profound, and I would say traumatic disservice to us having the spiritual resources we need to be able to navigate loss and sorrow and suffering and just a broken world. How do we possibly process what's happening in the Ukraine and so many other parts of our world without being able to trust what our heart, soul, emotional center, however you want to name it, without trusting what it is telling us and what we then need to bring as the offering of intercession and prayer?
There's a lot of giving up.
Yeah, go ahead, Joaquin. I was gonna call on you next because I know you've been waiting.
Like there's just a lot of hopelessness. I've been raised in a generation where the world is basically failing. And like I can literally think for the last 3 decades, yeah, we're all screwed. And that sucks.
I kind of feel like it's a relief to know that it's not true, that you were lied to.
I mean, I was raised with the whole belief of you can be whatever you can be, but no, you can't. It's just, we had 9/11, we had the 2018 breakdown, and then, you know, it just, there's no sort of like escape. And I think the silence kind of is like an admission to the reality of it. Like, yeah, then COVID. And so, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I know that I got to get to know you, Joaquin, in the midst of all this. So for me, that was such a good thing out of all this bad that you just mentioned. I just want you to know that was a really good thing out of all this bad that happened. you were here and I got to be interconnected with you. And that, as painful as all this other stuff was, is worth it. Just so you know. Because even more than just God, and God is huge, God saying that he loves you, I love you. And I love who you are, and I love all the struggles that you have and that you've continued to strive through them. And I love that you are still here today with me, and that I take as a victory through grief, that we are all grieving, that I grieve with you, and you're still here with me. And I'm so grateful for that, just so you know.
Yeah. And your grief is justified. Everything you said is true. And you're speaking to us, I guess, from the tomb. And no one can deny your grief or tell you it's time to come out. But your grief has something to say, I think, to all of us. And Shella just put the same thing in the chat.
Haven't seen, but thank you.
I think Margie wanted to share something with you.
Well, I just wanted to comment, Joaquin. I feel like what you're saying is exactly like what Wendy was saying about how everything, well, for me, how I would describe it is everything that you had put hope in and trust in just goes away in a period of grief, and you're flailing and you feel like, I don't know where to stand anymore. And I feel like, gosh, in every area of loss or transition, I know that's how I felt, and I'm feeling now over other issues. So I think you gave really a great insight into honestly how our younger generation is feeling. So I'm so grateful that you shared that, because you haven't had maybe the foundation that a lot of us felt like, even though maybe it was an illusion that there was safety or there was justice or things like that. I feel like you're getting to see it how it is. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm praying too that, God is so great. What you said, Wendy, that really, that we're beloved, that's really what I hold on to. And that's really hard to find sometimes.
Yes.
One of the things I said in the first service that I didn't say in the second, I think grief exposes so many lies, and it exposes lies about the messages of what is successful or what is productive or what is even health. And it forces us to question those things and to kind of wrestle with them. And I don't profess to have easy answers on any of that, except to say, I know for myself in this journey of grief, I have had to question where I found my identity, why those things matter to me, what value are they connected to? Do I believe in those values? Are they systems that I need to dismantle, resist? They leave me with questions like, how do I get off this train when it seems like the society and culture around me, that's the train everybody's riding? How do I face the fears of, will I have enough? Will I be enough? Will I be okay? And while I don't have all the answers on that, one thing I know for sure is that if I try to ask those questions in isolation, it is way harder to discern what is false and what is true than when I am with others who, like the facets of a diamond, we all see from a different vantage point. And so I need other people to help me discern what is actually true. I need people who are really different than me. I need people who I disagree with, to help me see what's true, so that as I groan in this tomb, waiting for the emergence of whatever new chapter is ahead of me, that I'll know what not to just repeat and find myself in a pattern that just leads to more untruth and loss. Because if my grief is going to be the valuable treasure I think it ought to be, I want it to teach me everything it needs to teach me. But I need others to help me do that.
I think, Wendy, what you're talking about now is happening in real time. Shella, she was vulnerable with us, and then Joaquin. And I think, pertaining to what Joaquin said, generationally, as someone who is from an older generation than Joaquin, I would say, in accord with Wendy's assessment, that what we thought was success, honestly, I kind of feel grateful for having failed in so many ways, for not keeping up, because it would have been pulling me farther away from my essential self. I just wasn't ready for all of that, and it wasn't real. And so in some ways, I'm grateful to have not measured up, if you will, because now I can just measure in.
That reminds me of one of the previous talks where I think it was Pastor Moore said that Jesus, if you think about it, Jesus wasn't very successful.
He didn't go very far. He didn't get very far. Never traveled outside of very big radius from where he was born. No books, no documentaries. Of course, everybody's doing it about him now, but
I like the train analogy, Wendy, because sometimes it feels like if you don't ride their train, they'll run you over, And so for me, that's been very much the feeling. Rosie, is that you? Are you unmuted? Do you want to talk? You want to say something, sweetie?
I don't know that I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh my God. I'm heavy in mine right now.
Oh, sweet.
Today is 5 months that my beloved went to be with the Lord. And I know what it is to lose my mother and my father and my brother and my grandparents, but my husband, my best friend. I just, you're right, Wendy. There's a lot of people who don't understand, they say things that they fucking don't make sense to me. They don't, because I feel like you didn't know us. You didn't know our relationship. I think because they don't know what to say. But in my relationship to the Lord, I do remind myself, I have reminded myself, it's what's keeping me sane, I think. to tell myself I am loved by the Lord. Like I know my kids love me, but it's like even that is like
Hey, we
depending
love you.
on depending on what they're going through and stuff is like, wishy-washy in its own sense. And I don't mean it like in a derogative way, Flock, so don't hold on to that. It's just different. It's just different. I remember 42 years ago, Easy and I, was a little bit longer than that, met. And I used to tell him, I don't know what you're about, you seem to be like a real nice guy and everything, but I'm not about like all them other people, all them other girls that are out there. I didn't even see myself like a woman, like maybe to myself, but we were young. And so we talked a lot about everything. We shared, we were active in all of these different causes that were important to us. But I remember we would write to each other, come this way to know me, one step at a time, one word at a time. And as our relationship grew, we kept adding to that. And I remember, I was a born again Christian and he was a non-believing Catholic, um, or non-practicing. Anyhow, yeah, we'd have these dialogues about religion and everything else. I don't know. I just miss my husband so desperately. And
Rosie, I'm going to ask Wendy to speak to what we've heard from you before we go to communion. Wendy, can you step in here?
Inviting others into our pain is such a sacred, intimate gift. So first of all, just thank you. I said that grief exposes us, and that can sound like a negative thing. But the corollary is that we know each other in our grief. We see each other in our grief, and our hearts connect in our grief. And so, Rosie, I think you sharing so honestly and so vulnerably allows us to see you. And inevitably I'm a pastor, and I think what a better transition to the communion table where we're seen, where we enter into the suffering of Jesus, where we share in that. So I feel a deep gratitude and a sacredness and an honoring, Rosie. And it isn't just intimacy when we share our joys, but it's an exquisite intimacy to share pain. And I see you.
We see you, Rosie. And thank you, Wendy. Thank you for being with us today, for giving yourself to administer ointment and salve on the wounds that are present here, with a word in season, a word to the weary. So thank you for that, Wendy, and thank you everybody for this moment where we honor the one who went all the way. Relentless love and integrity, the one who chose a course. It wasn't, didn't have a death wish. was not interested in dying. He was interested in living. But the decisions that he made to follow the will of the Father, no matter what the powers were saying and threatening, he went all the way. And here we are in a similar position where we are seeking the strength, like Jesus was praying in the garden. We are here praying for the strength to go all the way. As we prepare for communion, I'm going to ask everybody if you would just silently first just